Okay, my name is Jim Hodges. The subject of this talk is how Henty helps with history, character, language, geography, and all kinds of other good stuff, but we'll stop with that. And before I get into that specific subject, I want to tell you about George Alfred Henty, the man, who he was, when, where, why, and how he ended up writing so many books. He was born in 1832 in England, and he died in 1902. Queen Victoria was on the throne of England for virtually his entire life. I don't know how much you know about Queen Victoria. Victorian morals is often referred to negatively by our society today. Queen Victoria was very desirous of having her empire, the British Empire, founded on the Bible and biblical principles. Many 20th century historians would question whether or not she was successful. Be that as it may, her desire was to have a godly society and a godly empire. There was a very high moral tone in England and her possessions throughout the 1800s. Henty was born into that society, raised in that society, and completely incorporated into his personal character the traits of that society. He was a Christian. He was a godly man. He was a man of action. He was a military man. He was a well-educated man. He was a lot of things. But from birth and in his childhood, he was a very sickly child. He spent a lot of time in bed, sick, as a young man. He read a lot to while away the hours, because when you're sick and you can't get out of bed and you're 8, what else is there to do? There was no television, there were no iPods or video games, so he read. At a certain point in his life, he came to the conclusion that he didn't want to live a life of laying around in bed. And he realized, you know, if I'm going to live any other kind of life, I have to get out of this bed. I have to get outside. I have to start hunting frogs and climbing trees like all the other kids, or I'm going to be in this bed for the rest of my life. I don't know how old he was when that happened, but suffice to say, as a child, or maybe a young man, he realized, I got to get out of this bed. Which speaks to his character right there. So he just forced himself to get out of bed and get outside and hunt frogs and climb trees and play cricket and do all the things that all the other kids were doing, probably badly, because he'd been, you know, kind of emaciated sitting in bed for all those years. And he ended up being an incredibly large and robust and strong man. He took up boxing, because that's what you did in the 1800s in England. If you wanted exercise, you rode horses or you boxed. And he took up boxing and educated himself and was sent to good schools. His parents were reasonably well-to-do. So by his own volition, he got out of the sickbed and turned himself into a healthy young man. Having spent a lot of time in bed, he did develop a love for reading. So he was a voracious reader. So he's reading history, he's reading nature stories, he's reading anything he can get his hands on. Because of that, he's a very well-educated young man. He's going to the good schools that his parents can afford. He applies to and is accepted to Cambridge University. Slouches don't get into Cambridge. You know, the exams, the oral exams required to get into those institutions of higher learning in England were rigorous. You generally needed to know a couple of languages, and you needed to be able to declaim New Testament books in Greek. I mean, there were all kinds of things that you had to be able to do to get into Cambridge. I don't know what the requirements were for his particular test. Suffice to say, he got himself into Cambridge University. Not a bad accomplishment right then and there. He did not graduate from Cambridge. I don't know why. I haven't been able to figure out what the story behind that is. Probably because it was not an active enough existence for him. That's my guess. Instead, his father purchased for him a commission in the army. I'm pausing periodically, if you haven't noticed those kind of longer pauses, because in speaking extemporaneously, I have a very bad habit of saying a lot. So when there's a pause, you can fill in with an if it would make you feel better. His father purchased a commission in the supply department of the army for him. Well, let's see, 1800s England, sun never sets on the British Empire. Where was the army in the 1800s of England? Everywhere. Certainly Africa, certainly India, certainly Australia and New Zealand. They had possessions around the world. Hong Kong, I mean, they had possessions everywhere. We don't know the full extent of Henty's travels. We do know that because of his position in the supply department in the army, he was in the Crimean War on the front. Met Florence Nightingale. While there, he wrote letters home to his father. Dad, you wouldn't believe how messed up the military is. I know, because I'm a 20-year Navy veteran. He would write home what's really going on at the front. And his father, being the proud papa of this son who's in the military, even though he purchased the commission, takes these letters to the newspapers and says, you know, my boy is down in the Crimea with the British fighting against the Russians, and he wrote me this letter which I think might be of interest to your readers. And the newspapers said, well, you know, some kid's letter to his dad. Oh my gosh, wow. Yeah, I think they would be interested in reading that. So they started publishing his letters in the newspapers in London. Before you know it, people started looking forward to the next letter from Henty because he wrote so well, because he was so well read, so well traveled. We know that he was with Garibaldi. I don't know a whole lot about Garibaldi, but Garibaldi was kind of like the George Washington of Italy. He helped throw off the foreign potentates. Italy used to be just a bunch of individual nation states, kind of like the Vatican is today. And there was no country of Italy. Garibaldi was involved in bringing about unification and throwing off all the foreign potentates in Italy. Henty was with Garibaldi during that revolutionary period. He was present at the opening of the Suez Canal, so he was in Egypt. He was in Italy. We know he was in the Crimea. We know he was in England, because that's where he was born and raised. While he was traveling, right, he would send home letters. He was once captured and considered to be a spy by the enemy forces, but he was able to gain his freedom after a time because he had the tools of the trade of the reporter. He knew how to talk to these people. He knew how to get in and get out without being found out. And so anyway, he was just a real man of action, raised in a country that was based on biblical principles and was still trying to live them out under the reign of Queen Victoria. He got out of the military and was hired by these newspapers to be their special correspondent. And they would send him around the world to report on whatever was happening, wherever they happened to send him. And now he's a reporter. So he starts out a sickly child. He gets out of bed on his own and gets himself healthy because he didn't want to spend his life in bed. Takes up boxing, horseback riding, well educated, goes to Cambridge. He's in the military. He's writing letters home. Now he's a special correspondent for the newspapers. A pretty active life right there, if you ask me. While he was traveling, we don't know exactly where. Oh, pardon me. He then started working for his father, who had mining interests around the world. So we know that he was on the east coast of the United States, and we know that he was in California. We'll talk about that a little more later. So he's well-educated, he's well-traveled, he's a military guy, he loves to read, he's like a Renaissance man. He's got all of these great things going on at once. His wife died somewhere along the line during this progression, and he had to come home to care for his children. He had 4 children, Ethel, Maud, and 2 boys also. When he came home, having been well-traveled and knew a lot about history, in British society you eat dinner late. You have tea in the middle of the afternoon to tide you over, and you have dinner late. So they would have dinner late, and after dinner, he would tell his kids stories from history, from all of these different places that he had traveled, and he would make them characters in the storyline. So now, Ethel and Maud and the 2 boys whose names escape me, they're the characters in the story. They're living the history. They're going to all of these cool places that Daddy's been, so he can describe in great detail because he's been there, and he's a reporter, so he takes notes, and he's just got that kind of a mind. And a friend of his heard him giving these kids these talks. And he said, "George, those are fantastic stories. You should write them down and make books out of them." And George said, "Oh, give me a break. You know, they're kids' stories. Nobody wants to read kids' stories. Besides, I'm a reporter. You know, that's what I do. I'm speaking to an adult audience. Nobody wants kids' stories." Well, this friend prevailed upon him, and he finally said, okay. And this is what convinced me he was probably in South America also. His first book was called On the Pampas, P-A-M-P-A-S, which is the name of grasslands in Argentina. And of course, his children were in the storyline. The Industrial Revolution was taking place in England. A young family packs up and leaves England because there's no prospects there, and they come down to Argentina, and they have to fight off the natives and establish a life for themselves down in Argentina. Well, this was kind of what had happened in England and what was still happening in England. The British sent out people. There's people all over the world. Any English-speaking country today is because Britain was there first. So he wrote this book and peddled it to some publishers, none of which really showed a whole lot of interest in it for 2 or 3 years. And finally, a publishing house picked it up, published it, and it took off. It just took off like crazy. All of a sudden, he's like the author to get. And all of the young people in England just loved this story. So he wrote another one. And it did the same thing. He wrote another one. And it did the same thing. And he just kept coming out with new titles, and it kept being very, very successful. He ended up with a company in England called Blackie & Son. That was the name of the publisher. And by the time he died in 1902, he had written 122 historical novels. I have been recording his books since, how's that working out?
It's good.
Okay, good. I've been recording his books since 1999, 12 years. I have 18 of them done. He's pumping out 3 or 4 books a year, writing them. And I can't seem to get more than a couple a year recorded. I don't know how this guy did it, except we do kind of know how he did it. He was on contract with Blackie & Son. It was 2 or 3 books a year, depending. Oh, yeah, in the meantime, he's editing boys' periodicals, kind of like Boys' Life and those types of magazines in England. And so he's the editor in charge of them. So he's writing short stories for those in his spare time, while writing the novels while at home. So he's just unbelievably prolific. These stories were all in historical settings in foreign lands, and he, like I said, he ended up writing 122 novels, which is just really kind of mind-boggling when you think about it. And in addition to that, not only are there 122 of them, the shortest one that I have recorded, and I recorded it because it was really short, I had a short timeline to get this one done, is like 7.5 hours long. 200 pages, 250 pages. Most of them are 300. Two of them that I've recorded are 399 pages, 400-page books. Here's how he did it. He lived in London. I don't know if you've been to London or if you've been in any of their libraries or any of their museums, but let me tell you, the museums in London and England, well, let's put it this way. In Berwick the Briton, there's a town in the country called Londonion, which has been conveniently, for our sake, shortened to London. Berwick the Briton takes place in 60. That's 60. It's been around a long time. They've accumulated a lot of stuff in their museums and in their libraries. They have the Rosetta Stone, for crying out loud. So when Henty wanted to research and get additional information to put in his books, he went to the library system. He would go to the man who chronicled the Drake circumnavigation of the globe story and read his reports. He would get the writings of the priest who went with Cortez when he conquered the Aztecs in Central America, and he would read his notes. So he's going to original sources of people who were actually there as much as he is able, and he'd spend some time reading 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 books on the subject and the time period and the area in which he wanted to write. And if he didn't like them, he'd send a couple of back and get 2 more. So he's doing his research. In the meantime, he's got to develop a storyline in his head to make sure that the character or some important character in the book is at all of the signal events that take place for this time period in history. And once his research was done, once he had the storyline in his head, he never sat down with a pen and paper and wrote. They didn't have typewriters, I don't think. He paced back and forth in his room while some poor man in the corner with a pen and a piece of paper would scribble down as he narrated the story with all of the characters, with all of their lines, with all of the historical information, with all of the detailed descriptions of the flora and fauna, everything, just weaving together this massive tome of information with a great storyline to keep the kids' interest. And then that guy would go off and get a typeset, bring it back, he would proof it, make his corrections, send it off to give the final proof, and then, okay, go to press. What's he have to do now? I got 4 of these due this year. He'd start the process all over again, I'm sure, and just start working on the next one, start working on the next one. So he's got all of his research, he's been to a lot of the places he writes about. He's got the resources available to him at the library system, and he just has a great way to do a story in his head. So that's Henty. That's how the books came into being in the first place. He wrote 122 books, and that still just kind of blows my mind. Any author today, you know, who's the Western author that wrote a bazillion books? Somebody here reads Westerns. Not Louis L'Amour. You know who Louis L'Amour read growing up? Henty. Agatha Christie. Any Agatha Christie fans? You know who she read growing up? Henty. This guy was the foundation for a lot of the authors that became very popular in the 20th century. Arthur Schlesinger Jr., well-known Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, the curator of the Smithsonian Institution for many years, said, my interest in history began with my reading Henty novels. I mean, this guy had so much influence, it's really kind of amazing how he has spread from his pretty humble beginnings of a sick kid in bed. So, with 122 books, you can imagine that he covers a lot of history, a whole lot of signal events in history. The first title that he wrote about is called The Cat of Bubastes. Actually, that's a guess at the pronunciation. I really have no idea how to pronounce Bubastes because the only place I can find that word is right here in the title of this book. I think he just kind of made it up. But, you know, it works and it sounds ancient Egyptian, I guess. This book takes place in, I think, 2500 BC. The hero is a fine young man who the Egyptians have conquered his tribe, and he's taken back, and he's made a slave of one of the priests in their hierarchical, the Egyptian gods. They've got a lot of different gods. He's made the slave of a priest of the god Osiris, I think it is. Well, he becomes friends with the priest's son. They're goofing around in the backyard with a bow and arrow, and they accidentally kill a cat. You don't kill a cat in Egypt. You do not kill a cat in Egypt. So, and not only is it a cat, it is the sacred cat of Bubastes, which is allowed to run free in their backyard. So now they're out for him. They want to kill him. So in his escape attempts, he's running around Egypt, and he hooks up with friends, and so in the midst of it, you learn how to mummify a cat. You learn how to fatten up a duck for market. You learn how to fight an alligator. You learn, I mean, all of these things just get woven into the storyline, and of course he also describes their religious system, and which is pretty much synonymous with their political system. There's even a scene in there which is really funny. The boy discovers, I mean, he doesn't believe that there's all of these different gods. He thinks all of these different gods are really nothing more than manifestations of the different facets and personalities of the one true God. That's this young man's belief. As it turns out, that priest actually kind of agrees with him, and he's very reluctant to share that testimony with any of the other priests because he's out of the job. So at one point, the young man is running away, trying to evade capture, so he goes into the temple, and then he climbs up the stairs and behind, and he discovers a hole drilled into the top of the head of the statue of the god that temple is related to. And he realizes all the priests do is they yell into this hole, and they make everybody think that it's the voice of the god coming out of the mouth. So he uses that to his advantage. And he yells down the hole, and of course all the people that are pursuing him freak out because the gods are talking to them, and they all run away, and he makes his escape. So it's a fun way. Now, what did you just learn there? We got a false god. We've got a system that's based on falsehood. Well, that's how he just kind of gets that piece of information into your head through the storyline. He never comes out and just dictates dry, historical material. It's always, you're an active participant in it somehow. And that's what makes the Henty novels so engaging, because as you're listening to them, you're just hearing a story, which is really fun and exciting. But really, you're learning history, and you're learning geography, and you're learning politics, and you're learning religion. And I've gone completely off script here, but that's a good thing. So the reason I said all that is because this is the first one in the timeline. If you want to use the Henty novels as history, there's a great book out there called The Boy's Guide to the George Alfred Henty Historical Adventures, I believe is the name of it. The Boy's Guide to Henty is what you need to remember. Vision Forum sells the book. They do not have it here, but if you order it at their booth, they will ship it to you with no shipping, and it's $10. in that book is a chronological listing of 77 of the 122 books that Henty wrote. Why they stopped at 77, I do not know. You'll have to ask Bill Potter, he wrote it. One page is dedicated to each title. And it says the title of the book, the subtitle, the year of history that's covered in that, and there's 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph tells you what the history is. The second paragraph tells you a very short story of what the main character does. So you just get a real quick, the books are 400 pages. To get it in 1 page is a really good thing, trust me. See, I said it just runs chronologically. So if you want to incorporate them into your history curriculum, you just bring one out for whatever it is you're studying now. Have them read it to them. Oh my God, you could get an unabridged recording at the Jim Hodges audiobooks table. Had to do that. The critical thing to do, from my perspective, a dad, we homeschooled our kids all the way through high school. I have 3 really fine adult children. We never heard of Henty while we were homeschooling. Never knew anything about him. Until my youngest was probably a junior or a senior, and he read a couple of them and he liked them, but he was not really a reader, so I didn't make him. But what you want to do is you want to get the kids to like Henty as early as possible. And the best way to do that is for you to like them, and for you to make it a fun thing for them to hear a Henty or to read a Henty or to have you read a Henty to them. A very good title to begin with, I believe, is Under Drake's Flag. And the reason I say that is it starts on page 1. It just jumps right into an active story, and that helps younger kids. Oh, to listen to a Henty, I think 10 and up. To listen to an unabridged Henty, 10 and up, I think is about right. Unless they're firstborn, then they can go to 9, maybe 8. Babies, you might want to wait till they're adults. To read, I wouldn't recommend typically any younger than about 12, because they are not, they're tough books. I forgot to actually bring one in, but they are a solid book, and we'll get into a little bit more of why I say that in a minute. So that's how you use them as history. Listen to them chronologically if you want. Another option is to say, what 8, 9, 10-year-old boy isn't into knights? Right? Okay. So we've got, I didn't bring one here. There are 3 or 4 books that have knights are the main character. The best one to start with, I would say, is probably Winning His Spurs. Do you like Winning His Spurs?
That's the one I just said.
Is that a great, it's a great book.
I just had to clean out the G.A. Henty collection because we're planning on moving to Korea and it's just too many to carry. They're so heavy.
No.
But that is one of them I chose to keep.
I believe it. Winning His Spurs is a great story. The hero goes, what's his name? Cuthbert? Cuthbert the Lance, is that right? Cuthbert, the boy hero, goes with King Richard the Lionhearted on the 3rd Crusade to the Holy Land. So you learn all about the Crusades. And Henty tells you at the beginning, Pope Urban II promised to anybody who went on a crusade that if they died in service to the church, they would instantaneously go to heaven. Well, that's a pretty good inducement. So about 1/3 of the people went for that. 1/3 of the people went for adventure, just to get out of Europe. And 1/3 of the people went